branded a thief. The words rang off the church rafters before Adeline Marsh had even reached the altar, and the whole of Red Wing turned in their pews to stare at her as if her wedding gown had caught fire. "Stop the ceremony." Prudence Callow's voice cracked across the sanctuary, high and triumphant. She stood at the end of the aisle with Adeline's beaded reticule held aloft, its clasp sprung open, and inside it winked the unmistakable gold and garnet brooch that belonged to the groom's late mother. "I found it in her bag not 10 minutes past. She's a thief dressed up in white lace, standing there bold as brass to steal a good man's name along with his mother's jewels." Adeline's hand went cold in the crook of Thaddeus Pruitt's arm. She had never seen that brooch before in her life. "I don't understand," she said, and her voice did not carry the way Prudence's had, thin as it was with shock. "I never touched it." But the church had already made up its mind. A murmur swept the pews like wind through dry wheat, ugly and quick, and Thaddeus, her groom, the banker's son she had known since girlhood, drew his arm from hers as though her touch had scalded him. "Is this true?" he asked, not looking at her but at his mother, seated stiff and pale in the front row. "The brooch is Constance's," his mother said. "It has not left my keeping in 11 years, save for today when I lent it to Constance to wear beneath her collar for luck. It went missing not an hour ago. I did not take it," Adeline said again, louder now, because the shame rising in her chest was giving way to something harder. "Search me if you like. Search my room at the boarding house. I have taken in mending to keep myself fed since my father died, and I have never in my life stolen so much as a spool of thread." Thaddeus would not meet her eyes. "I can't marry a woman under such a cloud," he said, and the words fell into the silence of the church like stones into a well, and did not stop falling. He turned from her at the altar rail, in front of God and the Reverend and half the county, and walked back down the aisle he'd meant to walk up as her husband, leaving her standing alone in her wedding dress with the accusation hanging over her like a noose. She looked out at the sea of faces that had, only minutes before, smiled and wept happy tears at the sight of her walking toward her future, and now saw only suspicion where there had been affection. 2 years she had spent building a name for herself in Red Wing after her father's death left her with nothing but a rented room and a trunk of needles and thread. 2 years of careful stitches, of turning down offers that asked more of her than honest work deserved, of proving, sent by hard-earned scent, that a woman alone could keep herself decent in a town quick to assume otherwise. All of it seemed to crumble beneath her in the space of a single accusation, and she understood with a coldness that went beyond the shame how thin a woman's good name truly was when a town decided to doubt it. It was then that Ransom Teague rose from a pew near the back. He was not family, not close friend, only a cattleman who ran the largest herd for 40 miles and who had, twice, brought his torn shirts to Adeline's little shop for mending, because she did fine work and never gossiped over the pins in her mouth. He was broad-shouldered and sun-browned, a man the town both respected and slightly feared for his quiet, unhurried way of getting exactly what he meant to get. He walked up the aisle against the current of the fleeing wedding party, and every eye in the church swung to follow him instead. "Before anyone brands this woman anything," he said, "I'd like to see how that brooch came to be in her bag, since she says she never put it there." "She's caught red-handed, Mr. Teague," Prudence said, though her chin had begun to tremble. "What more proof do you need?" "I need to know who packed that reticule for her this morning," Ransom said, "since a bride getting dressed for her own wedding generally has help, and I'd like to know who else had reason to be in the room where it hung." The church went very still. Adeline felt her heart lurch with a fragile, unfamiliar hope. "Sarah Whitcomb helped me dress," she said. "And you, Prudence, you came in near the end, to fix my hem where it had come loose." Prudence's face went the color of the whitewashed wall behind her. "I only meant to help." "You knelt at my hem for a long while," Adeline said slowly, understanding dawning even as she spoke it, "with my reticule hanging from the chair not 2 feet from your hand." "That proves nothing," Prudence said, but her voice had lost its certainty, and her eyes flicked toward Thaddeus with a longing so plain that half the church saw it plainly too. Ransom's gaze did not waver from her. "Everyone in Red Wing knows you've carried a torch for Thaddeus Pruitt since you were both in short dresses at the schoolhouse," he said, not unkindly, but without mercy either. It would take a woman badly wanting a wedding stop to think of hiding another woman's own future inside her own reticule. That's a vicious thing to say, Prudence said, but she said it to the floor. The Reverend, a careful man who had married half the county and buried the other half, cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said, we ought to send someone to fetch the constable and let cooler heads examine the matter proper, rather than deciding a woman's character in the middle of a wedding. It was agreed on, though grudgingly by some, and in the confused, murmuring hour that followed, Adeline stood at the side of the church in her ruined white dress, feeling the stares of Redwing like pins against her skin. Sarah Whitcomb wept and apologized for having left the room at all. Thaddeus did not come to her. He stood by his mother, ashamed perhaps, but not ashamed enough to cross the aisle and take her hand. Ransom did. He crossed the little distance between them without asking anyone's leave and stood beside her as if he had every right to, which, by nothing but his own choosing, he did. You didn't have to do that, Adeline said, her voice unsteady now that the church's attention had drifted elsewhere. You'll have made an enemy of the Pruitts. I've never much cared for enemies who'd let an innocent woman hang for another woman's jealousy, Ransom said. I've watched you 3 years running, mending shirts nobody else could save, taking in washing so your little brother could stay in school instead of breaking his back in the mines. I know something of your character, Miss Marsh, whether the town remembers it today or not. Adeline felt her eyes sting, worse than the shame had stung them. They'll say I only latched onto you for one of a groom. Let them say it, Ransom said. I don't much listen to what this town says, never have. While they waited for the constable, Adeline sat in the small anteroom off the sanctuary where she had dressed that morning with such hope, and Ransom stood near the door as if to keep the rest of the church from crowding in on her further. You're shaking, Ransom said, and it was the first time all morning anyone had spoken to her, as though she were merely cold and not merely accused. I keep thinking of my father, Adeline admitted. He used to say a person's word was the only fortune worth keeping, since it couldn't be stolen, only given away by the person who owned it. I never gave mine away. I don't know how to prove that to people who've already decided otherwise. You don't have to prove it to people who've already decided, Ransom said. You only have to know it yourself, and let the ones worth keeping find their way to believing it too. The constable arrived within the hour, a deliberate, unhurried man named Otis Bell who had known Adeline's late father and had no love for the Pruitts' habit of deciding guilt before evidence. He searched Prudence's own room at her family's insistence her mother demanded it. Certain her daughter would be cleared and found, tucked beneath a false bottom of her hope chest. 3 other trinkets reported missing from Redwing households across the past year. A silver thimble, a cameo pin, a strand of pearl beads. Small things easily pocketed, easily blamed on other hands. Prudence broke down before the questioning was half finished, weeping that she had only once for something of Thaddeus' world to belong to her, and that seeing Adeline dressed for a wedding she herself had dreamed of for years had been more than she could bear. By evening the truth had travelled through Redwing faster than the lie had that morning, the way truth so rarely does but occasionally, mercifully manages. Adeline sat on the porch of her boarding house still in her wedding dress, too tired and too raw to change out of it, when Ransom Teague came walking up the road with his hat in his hand. I heard you weren't wearing a ring by supper, he said, and there was something careful in his voice, something that had not been there in the church, when his courage had been all business and no doubt. Thaddeus hasn't come, Adeline said. I don't expect he will. I don't know that have him now if he did. I wasn't asking after Thaddeus. Ransom turned his hat once in his hands, an unaccustomed nervousness in so steady a man. I've got 1,100 acres and a house too big and too quiet for one man alone in it. I've got no patience left for towns that brand a woman guilty before they trouble to ask her a single honest question. And I've got, if you'll have it, a wedding dress you're already wearing and a preacher who hasn't gone home yet. Adeline stared at him. You're asking me to marry you. Today. In this dress. I'm asking you to marry a man who already knows exactly who you are, Ransom said, instead of one who threw you over the moment it cost him something to believe in you. For a long moment Adeline said nothing at all, turning the whole strange, terrible, transformed day over in her mind the accusation, The church's cruel, quick judgment, Thaddeus's back retreating up the aisle, and this quiet, steady man crossing that same aisle toward her instead of away. She thought of 3 years of torn shirts brought to her shop, and how he had always waited, unhurried, while she worked, and had never once made her feel small for earning her bread with her hands. "Redwing will talk," she said at last. "Redwing already is," Ransom said, and something in his weathered face eased toward a smile. "Might as well give them something worth talking about." She rose from the porch step in her wedding dress, the very dress that had been meant for another man's ring, and found her hand steady when she placed it in his. They were married that same evening in the small chapel at the edge of town, by lantern light, with only the Reverend Otis Bell and a handful of neighbors who had come not out of duty, but because they had seen the whole day unfold and wanted at the last to see it end right. Adeline Marsh became Adeline Teague before the sun had fully set on the day that had begun with her branded a thief before God and all of Redwing, and ended with her standing, vindicated and chosen, beside a man who had never once doubted her. Prudence Callow left Redwing before the month was out, her family's name humbled but not broken, and the town found other gossip soon enough. Thaddeus Prout sent word once weeks later, asking whether Adeline might reconsider a hasty match made in the heat of a hard day. And Adeline burned the letter in the stove without answering it, having already learned exactly what a man's steadiness was worth when it was tested, and what it was worth when it was not. Ransom's house proved too big and too quiet no longer. Adeline filled it with the small, steady industry she had always known, and Ransom never once made her feel she had come to him under a cloud, only that she had come to him exactly when she was meant to, for years after. When anyone in Redwing spoke of the wedding day that had gone so wrong, and then so right, they spoke of the cattleman who had stood up in a church full of doubters and crossed the aisle for a woman everyone else had already condemned, and of how he never once, in all the long good years that followed, let her forget that he had chosen her first, and would have chosen her 100 times more.